Everybody. Welcome to our book talk with author Dana McSwain, who in my Brady Bunch categories right here is in the lower left. I thought we could get started by just introducing who we are, and then we could talk about how we know each other, and then we can jump into the discussions. I think we're going to spend about an hour today chatting. We've got some questions prepped, but obviously we can devolve a little bit into whatever conversation comes forward. But we're talking today about Roseneath, my beautiful copy that Dana dropped off to me, which is pretty exciting. So Dana, since you're the author, you want to go ahead and get started?
Sure. I wanted to thank you guys all, first of all, for the investment of time that you all put into reading this. It's not a short book, and also for agreeing to meet today to discuss some of the themes in the book and how you felt about those, and sort of pull the whole thing apart. I really appreciate that. I'm an author. I live here in Cleveland, Ohio. This is my 5th book, and it's a big departure from the books that I've published prior to this. Prior to this, most of my work was satire, action, adventure, romantic comedy, and this book, however, I've been working on for close to 10 years, and it's a big investment, emotionally, and for me, a lot of it has to do with some themes that I've dealt with in my life as a woman, and additionally, it's a chronicle of the time that my husband and I spent in a house that we purchased here locally in one of the inner ring suburbs that we spent 10 years restoring. It was a 1921 Tudor revival, and if you've ever lived in an ancient house, they all feel haunted. And spent a lot of time alone in that house, and it went in a lot of directions, but the big direction that it went to was to this book. So that's all I have to say about myself.
Who wants to go next?
I mean, we all already know how we know each other.
I know, but this is going on Dana's. This is going on Dana's thing. I'll do it. So, for anyone who might be watching this, I'm Sydney. I'm also an author, right? But I spend most of my days doing exactly what we're doing right now, which is facilitating webinars and doing technology training. So I've known Dana. God, when did we meet? We met under the greatest circumstances ever. We met through a friend. We worked at the same place, but not at the same time. So we met through a mutual friend at a craft fair here in Cleveland, Bazaar, where I was helping my friend man a booth. And I believe my first words to Dana were what were my first words to you?
I mean, I don't remember what it was, but what I remember is you bending over and showing me the backs of your thighs and being like, "What do you think? Tattoos, stars, right here and right here."
Okay, that's what it was. I knew it had something to do with my lower half, and just being like, "Hi, I'm going to be overly familiar with you," and it was just like love at first sight. And I have had.
Kind of friend I want. I mean, honestly.
Right. I don't know how to be any other way than how I am, but I've actually had the strange and wonderful privilege of being able to be with this book through multiple iterations. And so my conversation will probably be fairly garbled, because it's sort of like having a ghost story within a ghost story, because previous ideas and themes and even characters are going to kind of weave in and out. We'll be like, why did you go from here to here? I remember when this was a thing. So I think it'll be an interesting contribution. I hope. It could just be confusing and boring, but we'll see. So Adria or Heather?
I'll go. My name's Heather, and I am trained as an interior designer, and I work as a project manager for an office furniture company. It's terrifying every day, but not as terrifying as the book. But, how did we meet? I think I met Sydney. You and I met first.
Yep.
And then there was hula hooping, and then there's the Renegade Book Club, and that is that's the circle of us.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Cool.
So yeah, I mean, I'm Adria Clark. I own a bakery, I'm in my very messy bakery office right now. So I met Dana through Sydney, and Sydney I met through hooping, which is how I met you as well. So it was kind of Renee was our common.
Yes,
our friend Renee.
Our common thread, who used to be in the book club. And so, yeah, and that's how I met Dana, obviously, through Sydney. So don't remember when I met any of you, really. It's been a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, no.
Maybe we've always known each other.
Maybe I felt like that when I first met you.
Yeah, it's true. Like, oh.
Yeah,
Because
I was
you're my
subbing that
people.
one class for Renee. I think you and I were in different classes, but it was when I was subbing a class
Yep.
that I met Sydney, and I was like, I like her.
Yeah. That's my person.
That's
Give
a
me
person
that
for me.
person. Right.
Did she show you her thighs first too, or?
I
don't think
probably had
so.
hoop against it. I mean,
They
had
were
to show
probably
her my
evident
boobs.
in class
Right.
at some point, but
So we were all in a book club years ago together that sort of, went off in its own way, the way book clubs kind of fall apart over time. Everybody gets kind of busy. And you guys were all really kind enough to agree to read advanced copies of my book, which will be coming out in October. And so that we could have a book club discussion a COVID book club discussion about it. Socially
Lord.
distant.
Socially distant book clubs. Yep. All right. Okay, so intros. I think we're going to have this run. Dana's going to be as our author and as the person who's sort of gathering intel and information and general impressions for her site and for her company. We're going to have her run the questions, but I'll be here to kind of move things along if we need anything having to do with technology or facilitation, as is my want, but hopefully I'll be mostly jumping in and giving my own impressions. So Dana, do you want to walk us through some of your questions?
I mean, first of all, I'd just like to start with asking for like general impressions of the book overall. As a little introduction, Roseneath is a Gothic horror story. It's set in Lakewood, Ohio. Loosely in Lakewood, Ohio, and then in a couple other areas as well. And it's simply the story of two people who are grieving. They move into an abandoned house in Lakewood, of which Lakewood usually has a lot of those, with the hopes that a change of scenery and a new project will heal some of the wounds that they've incurred over the years. And they find themselves in the path of two forces that are completely beyond their control. And then the story takes off from there. So I really just wanted to start with general impressions of the book. Anything that stood out to you, any lines that stood out to you? I have a list, hold on. Yeah, I think, anything about plot, pacing, characters, favorite characters, characters you hated, parts of the book you liked, parts of the book you hated, that sort of thing. Don't hold back. I can take it.
I usually tear through books pretty fast, and honestly, I skim a lot. And I couldn't with this. I didn't want to, but it was also just scary enough that I had to put it down. I was like, okay, I finished that. I'll deal with it tomorrow. It was actually that. It was very I wouldn't say maybe scary. It was so suspenseful. Mm-hmm. And then I would be like, okay, I'm done with this chapter, and okay, I'm going to put this down now. So it took me, it did take me a long time to read it, much longer than I normally take. So that was
I read a lot at night. Like I read right before, in bed right before I fall asleep. And I was having the same stuff too, where I was kind of like, and it was sort of very newly in the quarantine, and everything was very weird. The whole world was so weird. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's still weird, but it was especially newly weird at the point when I was reading that book, and I was it would be like, okay, I'm tired. It was kind of the same thing where I'd be like reading, and I'm like, I think I should not read this anymore right now. Like I'm trying to fall asleep, and it's not helping.
Right.
I wanted to say, and this is like a blanket statement too, that, I gave this book out, and then we went into quarantine. And then I thought, oh, wow, what a great thing I've done to these lovely women that I know. It's a book that's basically about paranoia and isolation.
Isolation, yeah.
The isolation part. And I thought.
Right, and one of them not leaving the house, yeah. Yeah.
While
all the outside forces. I don't know if any of you are also horror readers, generally speaking.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so I feel like being a horror fan myself, I think one of the things that made an impression on me through all of the revisions that I've read is that I feel like there's been a resurgence more recently about like spotlighting female horror writers, like somehow this is a new thing, like somehow like Shirley Jackson just never existed or Angela Carter just never existed before. So it's kind of like there's been a spotlight on female horror authors, but I haven't really read too many. This is going to sound so shitty, but I haven't read too many of them that I've been super impressed by. I've just been kind of like, I feel like you're spotlighting these folks in the news or in literary magazines because they're female. And I hated that because it was just like everyone should be on the same, level. But there is something about Roseneath that feels very feminine to me. Like the horror in it struck me sort of in my womanhood, if that makes sense, not in a sexual way. That was not a Maidenhead reference. And I think one of the things that sticks with me through this version, so I should say the first time I got to read a copy of this, Dana gave it to me in a binder, like a 3-ring binder, right after I'd moved into my old new house. I just moved recently, and it was big and it was empty and I wasn't used to everything, and she made me scared to go in my basement pretty much for 5 years. Like every time I would go in the basement, we had like a sort of an old-fashioned like incinerator door, and like it was not a scary house. It was a little haunted, but it was like haunted by a cat, we think, not a scary thing. But and I really think like there really wasn't anything about that basement. It was nice and light. There was very roomy, but it just got in my head in a way that other horror authors that I've read more recently, like I just feel like there's a lot more, like I'm a big Stephen King fan, I'm a big horror author fan there. And it felt like it would hit me on the surface and then bounce off again. Like I'd be scared in the moment and then I'd walk away and maybe a couple things would stick with me. But this book got into me in a way that I couldn't shake for a really long time. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that you can get so deeply enmeshed in what's happening in Georgia's head, the protagonist, most of the point of view. And I just couldn't shake it. And to me, that was just a level of horror that was so personal. And I think that that's something that's really unique. I think folks reading this book will experience a different kind of fear. And again, like Heather said, it's not like, oh God, it's so gory or it's so brutal. It's intense and it's suspenseful, and it's the kind of thing that keeps you thinking. It's very thoughtful horror. So it's really about imagining what's coming next and what's coming next. And then you read what happens and you're like, well, didn't see that coming.
You do, and sometimes you want to go, no, don't go in there. Don't do it.
Don't do it. Don't go in the basement. Right.
Don't do that.
And I'm really glad you brought that up about femininity in particular. And that's something that I've always been trying to be very thoughtful about in my work, is that one of my big influences is Mary Shelley. And Mary Shelley is credited with creating the science fiction genre, but what she did for horror is also incredible, because I think, particularly as a woman, there is a level of horror in the idea of creation that I think women live with every day, deciding whether or not to reproduce. When you're pregnant, anyone who's been pregnant, it's a horrifying endeavor. I mean, a lot of women, it's beautiful, it's wonderful, it's magic. It is, but it's also very graphic. It's brutal, and it's literally putting your life in danger every time. And I think that women have a unique perspective on horror because of, particularly when you're talking about a lifetime, and many women's lifetimes of being subjugated in a lot of ways, physically and sexually and that sort of thing. And I think I've always looked to female horror writers because they have a way of pushing buttons, I think.
Well, I think what's interesting too is that I like your point about, every woman who's been through it knows that it can be beautiful but horrifying. But I also feel like there's a lot of attention paid now to like the good partner, where it's just like, well, they help and they're there, and men can be in the delivery room, or your female partner can be in the delivery room with you, and they're doing all those things, but like you're still doing it alone. And I think the isolation and the aloneness and like the fear and bravery that you have to go through to do this alone is just like, it kind of blew the top of my head off. I was just like, nope, under no circumstances could I handle this. So I think that's, that really brought the isolation to the surface.
How terrible she felt like during her pregnancy like resonated with me, because I felt like shit through both of my pregnancies. Hated being pregnant, hated every fucking minute of it. Like, I did it anyway, but it was just like, I know, the whole thing of people like, I've had people say like, oh, I've never felt better than when I was pregnant. I was like, well, that's nice for you, but
my mom said that. I'm like, oh,
like, okay, that's cool, but like, it is like, I mean, obviously wasn't as bad as she was, but it was still like that, just kind of like that misery of like when you just feel so bad. You just feel there's nothing you can do. You just have to endure it. There's like,
and it's a solitary endeavor. I mean, no matter how helpful a partner is, you are alone. You're alone every minute of it, and at the end, you're definitely alone.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think again is particularly horrifying for women. And I feel like you get so caught up in, like you were saying, oh, it's this beautiful thing. Sure, it's beautiful, but it's also,
God,
horrific.
It's also horrific. And I love that. I mean, for someone who has not been pregnant and for someone who very specifically chose not to have children, I felt like, you do a lot of, people demand a lot of you. They demand a lot of reasoning, like, well, why? Or, your life isn't complete, or you're lesser than, or whatever. They don't listen to it being right. They don't listen to it being a choice. And I feel like there was something very validating about the experience to say, like, here, I mean, obviously it's a very extreme example and there's a lot of metaphor to it. It's not like, oh, she's just, I don't want to spoilers for people who haven't read, but what happens to her is not what happens to most people when they become pregnant and go through a pregnancy. But there was something very validating in seeing the idea of what disinterested me writ large, kind of like I can point to something and be like, this is what I feel like it would be. And like, this is what I don't like. Obviously that wouldn't happen to me, but those are my feelings about it. Like, those are my fears about it, the isolation, the pain, the terror, like what's happening to me, sort of that alien experience. Like, for me and for other folks, I'm sure that entire endeavor, the idea of it outweighed the joy I know that I would have had. Do you know what I mean? And so some people are, I mean, and other people's reasoning, they're just like, I just don't want him, or I don't think I'd be a good parent, or whatever it is. And I had some of that, but a lot of mine was fear-based, and not being able to not only just like trust my ability to go through it physically, but mentally. A depression runs in my family, and I was convinced that if I ever went through with it, that I would have terrible postpartum depression. And there was a lot of that in this, because the two main characters start off grieving, like going into the process already being kind of a wounded animal, just hit home for me. And it was just like, all of a sudden, like in the midst of this, even as you're getting kind of glimpses that she might be healing because of other things that happen in the book, like she's starting to become a whole person again, and then something comes in and all of a sudden it's just broken apart. Like, you're broken apart because you become pregnant. And it just like, I don't know, these themes just like hit home in a way I didn't expect, not having been a person who has children, if that makes sense.
And that was something that always, I mean, and we'll get to like the religious mythology, involved in this story, but that was something that always bothered me growing up as a kid. I grew up in a very religious family, and I would be sitting there in church, and, the whole like Magnificat, the song of Mary, she's so excited to be pregnant with this supernatural being. And I remember sitting there thinking that would be horrifying. The idea of being pregnant with something that is not strictly your child or of your creation, there's nothing beautiful about that. It'd be a horrible intrusion. It'd be absolutely terrifying. Mm-hmm. And I like I said, well, we can talk about this later, but I definitely spent a lot of time daydreaming in church, if that's not completely obvious to anyone.
A little bit.
Absorbed nothing except the daydreaming. But which brings me to another question that I had. I can't memorize things, so I'm reading off a piece of paper.
I have it right next to me on my monitor.
Yeah, me too. It's right here. It's fine.
So there are many themes in Roseneath: good and evil, fidelity, grief, redemption, resurrection. What themes stood out to you the most? And this is by no means a complete list. So if there was another theme that really stood out to you, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
I think for me, the one I keep coming back to just because it felt like a thread throughout everything, no matter what. I mean, good and evil, yes, because we're battling forces that are both within humanity and beyond. So we're dealing with both metaphysical things and also very human things. But for me, the big one was grief. I feel like there was a layer of sadness through everything that just never, it was like a wound that just never healed. And every time something would get close to closing up that wound, it would open back up for some other reason. And it was like, you know, you start off with grief and then you try and come together through physicality, and then you try and come together through shared pregnancy, and there's this aloneness and this, you know, possible infidelity and this, you know, separation, and you come together because you've got a new, again, I don't know how much we should be spoiling or not, but you've got this other being in your house that you can connect to, and that might really be healing some things that feel very broken inside you, but it's maybe not the relationship that you would expect to be, you know, to be healing. And then I even think that there was some grief in, as much as there was horror and as much as there was just that fear of not being able to recognize the person that you love and trust most in the world, there's also some sadness there of just being like, we never quite got back to where we were. Like, we never quite got healed from where we broke in the start. Was really sad.
I think the thing that the thread that I see running through it is kind of the flip side of that, though. I see resilience and like perseverance, because I feel like she keeps getting her legs kicked out from underneath her, but she keeps pressing on, you know, and that's how she gets through at the end too, is like she just doesn't 100% ever give up, you know, and something always keeps her going. Love of, I don't know how, are we not supposed to be discussing details of the
No,
book?
I think we can. I just get nervous when I wasn't. I'm like, are we
I was like sitting about I was like, are we not supposed to like say anything?
She's my favorite character. So.
Like the love of the ghost and the love of her husband, even when she's feeling betrayed, like she still kind of like sees why, like she had, I mean, like, you know, at first she's immersed in the betrayal for a while, but then kind of fights through the reasoning behind the betrayal and figures it out. I mean, she keeps kind of pressing on, and like, even though all of these things are against her, I feel like she keeps, like, I know she just won't be defeated in a lot of ways. Right. Or like it would have been so easy at so many points of the book to just roll over, and like she never really does.
I noticed that too. What really struck me was, not only was it an emotional thing for her to keep pressing on and be like, oh, that went horribly. Okay, but also physically. It was just the way you wrote about her. To me, it was so physical. She was always like, you know, don't look down, don't, you know, it was always it was something about her body and how she had to move someplace or go somewhere. And the way that's woven together with her emotions, it's the same. She keeps going back. She's determined and she's going to do it. And emotionally and physically, she has to.
And also, you know, I think that speaks to like the emotional and the mental structures that people who are victims of incredible trauma build. You know, even just in your day-to-day life, like not inside a house that's haunted, but outside of that, you know, you build these structures so that you can keep going. And I think, you know, humans are particularly resilient with that, you know, to pick themselves up from horrible tragedies, not just tragedies, but also traumas, and just keep moving. I'm fascinated by that, how people do that. It's incredible. It's an incredible power, I think.
I think is it okay if I say one? So yeah. One of the things that struck me is seeing it actually bound. I love that you like basically did like an elevator pitch. You know, you've got your one sentence summary on the back, and I thought about this as we were coming to this discussion because I know one of the questions was sort of like, hey, you're asked to describe a book, you know, describe this book to someone who hasn't read it. Like, how would you make it not just appealing to them, but how would you describe it to someone? And I think I thought it was so fascinating that you pulled out pieces that are happening, like true pieces, like you kind of gave away some of the surprises in the book, but someone reading it would not really necessarily know what you mean. Like you'd be like, oh, okay, so is it okay if I read it real fast? So so it's Georgia Pritchard's dream house has a dead child in the attic and a monster in the basement, but she can't tell her husband because she's not sure it's really him anymore. First of all, terrifying. Second of all, you pulled out the dead child in the attic and the monster in the basement. But someone going in would be like, well, you know, they think, oh, there's a corpse in the attic, and then there's like something horrifying that she doesn't recognize in the basement, but it turns out to be something completely different. Like what's what am I trying to say? Like what does she connect to, and how does that actually save her in some ways? And it's just like I found it fascinating to say, like, this is how we would describe this book to someone, but you'd still have to be like, just read it, because it's not quite what you think it's going to be, which is super fascinating too. I'm trying to find I have some. You can go ahead and ask the next question when I'm pulling up some of my favorite quotes.
Oh yeah, no, I was going to say, I'm not one of those authors who's afraid to spoiler, because I feel like
it's spoiler enough to like make people want to read, you know, like
yeah, that's what I mean. Like this is spoilery, but like it's still not saying what it is. Yeah.
And like even if you explain to someone what the book is about, it's still about the journey through the book. So like, you know, you can give someone all of the high points of a book, but you still, you know, it's kind of meaningless out of context. So it doesn't worry me at all. It doesn't, you know, which brings me to another question. So there's two different classes of characters in Roseneath. You have physical, and then you have metaphysical, different kinds of metaphysical characters. Of those characters, which type of character resonated for you the most? And if you're comfortable enough, of those types, which specific character resonated for you the most?
I think Georgia resonated with me. I can't speak, but the most. I feel like I identified more with the physical characters and their relationship between her and her husband. I mean, obviously the other characters are very important to the story, but I feel like I identified more with the physical people, and specifically Georgia, just because, I don't know, probably because she's the woman, like, and kind of see things from her point of view better, and just kind of understanding her journey and her grief and like her motivations.
I feel similarly. I don't know if it's for the same reasons or not. I mean, definitely because she's a human character, and there are things that I'm going to find parallel. She's married, she's got, you know, moving into this house, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things that has struck me throughout is that, you know, knowing that you grew up in a very religious household, and knowing that there are some pretty age-old themes running throughout. I mean, just the basic idea of good and evil and how that's represented in this book, and in actual characters that you can talk about, and that you hear talking, and that you see happening. Sorry, hair being crazy. For me, there's always, I have a lifelong struggle with religion and spirituality, and particularly with not having grown up, or I shouldn't say not growing up with anything, but growing up with a very mixed idea. I had friends and family who are all pretty faith-based, and I grew up with literally nothing. And so I would go to my grandmother's house, and we'd go to Methodist church, and I'd go to my, you know, best friend in high school's house, and she went to like a Lutheran church, and she was extremely religious. And then I had a really good friend who would take me to Catholic Mass every Sunday, and it was just this constant struggle to understand, and to this constant reminder that I was on the outside. And so I felt connected to Georgia in that way, because it almost felt like things outside of her control, not kind of like things outside of her control were happening to her. But as an abstract reader, I kept wondering if I was missing things because I didn't have all the information. Like, would I have known more if I grew up going to Bible study? Would I have known more if I had studied the Bible more? Would I have known and understood themes better, or identified more with a different character if I had had some different knowledge set going in. It didn't ruin the book for me, and ruin's even too hard a word. It didn't make me love the book any less. It made me want to know more. It made me want to reread it, having gone back and done my history, if that makes sense. Like I wanted to go back and be like, was there more to this aspect of Michael? Or was there more to this aspect of this particular battle? Is there a reason that it showed up in this way? Like, you know, Dana used this word to describe, you know, this fight or this feeling she was having. And I found myself almost pulling myself out of the story more to see, like, is that a word that's in the Bible? You know what I mean? There was just some themes that I felt like were passing over my head in a way that was making me uncomfortable and had to face in myself that I was just lacking in knowledge. And then when I was done, I realized that the feeling I was feeling was that same sense that I got when I was a kid of feeling like I was left out. So there was a part of the story I couldn't access because I didn't have it as a kid. But what was awesome was, instead of feeling like, well, fuck it, like I guess I'm just never going to be a part of this, I was like, there's a way in here. Like I can take some of the things that made me question something or made me wonder something, and I can go back and talk about it. Like I can talk to you about it, or I could go back and reread it, or I could find some things online to kind of fill in those gaps. And without spoiling too much, I know we'll talk about it soon, but I also know that there are more books coming and that those themes are going to get hit even harder as we move on. So it's kind of like knowing that I don't know if I am saying this right, but I almost want to like bolster my own background knowledge before hitting the next ones. Cause I'm just like, okay, this reminds me of how ill prepared I am to talk about anything religious or spiritual. So I better like get my knowledge on before I tackle book 2.
No, and that's something that I wanted to ask Adrienne and Heather. Did the religious mythology and you know, all of the symbolism and that sort of thing, was that accessible for you, or was that something that was like a little bit of like a learning curve? You know, like Sydney was saying, like this is something that's a little bit, you know, outside of my experience.
I was raised going to church, and I don't go to a regular church now, but it was accessible. But interestingly, because I'm using my faith that I have now, and I looked at it not as religion, I looked at it as it more like magic, and almost like Alice in Wonderland. That's how I accessed it. Even though he's an archangel, even though it's such a weird how I kind of wove it together in my head that made it make sense. But I brought my magic.
Oh, I love
themes
that.
into it. I just brought them in. I was just like, whatever. So
and like, what is an archangel?
Mm-hmm.
Right? You know, it's a great question. And I think that's what you're trying to ask, you know, what does that mean in the context of my own belief system? And that makes as much sense as anything. I agree completely.
Yeah. So I wasn't reading it as, I wasn't feeling it as religion. I was feeling it as how I am now versus how I was when I was a kid, I guess.
And that's something that I always, like when I was growing up, I grew up in a very strict evangelical church. And it was, we were taught to fear God. And so I remember waking up at night and running to my mother and crying because I thought I was going to go to hell. That level of fear that was instilled in me as a child in my faith system. And then I would go to church with my grandmother, who was a devout Roman Catholic. And I would sit there and couldn't really follow the mass because, well, mostly half of it was in Polish. So I had no idea what was going on. I don't speak Polish. But I would be looking at the stained glass windows. And to me, it looked more like I've always approached it more. I'm not a religious person. I've always approached it more as mythology, which I think is in line with what Heather's saying. And I always felt that it sounded terrifying to me, the idea that there were these creatures and they're around us, but you can't see them, and they have this limitless power, and we are on every level subjugated to them. And I thought, what a frightening belief system. It scared me more than anything, and probably why I'm not a religious person to this day. No disrespect intended. It's really an overwhelming belief system, you know, if you look at it objectively. I don't know what you think about that, Adria.
Well, it's funny. I had a very diverse religious upbringing, because like when I was little, my parents thought they were Christians, and I went to Bible school, and then like, I don't know, they were like every religion under the sun, and ultimately they ended up Wiccan, you know. So I was just like by the time I got to high school, I was like, oh, okay, all religion is bullshit anyhow. So, because you can't even make up your minds what you want to be. So I'm like very firmly, I mean, yeah, I guess I'm agnostic, but like it's like I don't believe that there's nothing. I just don't want to like try to define what that is. But I've you know gone to church with friends, like a lot of people, you know, and studied art history in college too. So like you get a lot, and it's just culturally around, like you kind of understand the overarching themes. And I was thinking too, one of my daughter's best friends is religious, and the thing that she is most terrified of is angels.
They're terrifying.
Right? Like, so
They're
she's
scary
like
as shit.
those are scary.
Right?
So,
They're so scary.
right. So I was just thinking, like, I was like, oh, I don't think they're supposed to be scary. But like, if you really think about it, they're terrifying.
Terrifying.
So, but I think like,
Terrifying.
Heather's point about it being, and also Dana's, like, it's just more of a mythology, and not necessarily about like adhering to that particular, I mean, I feel like you pulled in a lot of different cultural touch points, like beyond just that religious theme. Like there were so many other like fairy tale references, and other, like, you were like, you know, if there was like from the cloud of the world, there was like so many different touch points. And so that was not the only like story you were roping into your story. So I mean, I got it. I was like one of those things where I did understand. I was surprised by it at first. I was like, oh, I was definitely not expecting it to go this direction. I was thinking it was going to be more like classic ghost story before we began, and then I was like, oh, nope, that's not. That's not how we're going.
Not where we're headed.
I mean, there was a classic ghost in it, but that was just one part of the whole story.
Well, and you know what? I think that's an interesting jump into another question that I had about the ghost in the story. There's a ghostly character in the story, the little dead girl in the attic named Edith Harkness. And how does, in what ways does Edith Harkness, represent the age-old like ghost story character, and how does she deviate from it? How is she different from ghost portrayals in other books that you may have read? She
grows. She ages. I was like, what is she doing?
What's happening? Why are you bigger?
Yeah, it was amazing.
Also her voice. Just
yes.
Her, and I don't mean just like for those watching, like her voice changes. I mean like the words that come out of her mouth, like
yes.
her little catchphrases, and just like you can just the voice that she played. She was like Miss Fisher from Murder Mysteries in my head. I was just like, you sassy little thing. Like it humanized her to a point where you'd catch yourself being like, oh no, wait, she's a ghost. Like she became more human as she went. Like she's a real character, even though she's a metaphysical creature. She's my favorite character in the book. P.S.
Oh.
I love her. Like, and it's funny because again, I was privileged enough to read an early version of it when she was different, and she scared the living crap out of me. That was like the first scary thing in that book, where I was just like, what is this? Like, what is this? I haven't read anything quite like this before. There was still that like aspect where she was growing and she was changing, and I kept thinking, oh God, she's going to possess her and she's going to do something horrible and she's the big bad. Like it took me a while to realize where you're going in that first draft, and I felt like I immediately connected to her in a different way this time around. I was much more accepting of her being otherworldly, where I was just like, oh, it's Edith, like here we go. And I think part of it was the relationship, her relationships beyond Georgia, I'll say.
Yeah, that's something that I'm a mother, and I spend a lot of time with children, but there's something, children can be scary. And especially when they're young, they're so unpolluted. I'm sorry?
They say weird things.
They do. And I think they say those weird things because they are unpolluted by the experiences that we have. So they look at things in a completely different way than we do. And usually it's horrifying. And I love my children, I do, but they've scared the bejesus out of me sometimes when they were younger with the things that they would say and the things that they would do. And I would say I definitely drew heavily on that when I was creating the character of Edith. Also, I had a lot of fun doing, just as an author, like you do a lot of research and just researching, what would a child at the turn of the last century be like? Like, how would they talk? What would they play with? What would they eat? That sort of thing. It's interesting how little children have changed, I would say.
Fascinating. What was it like for you building Nathan's character? I feel like you were able to get his point of view in there, even though he wasn't always entirely himself. And I just wondered what it was like in general, just because I struggle with this myself, writing a male point of view, a father to be, and someone who's got some shit. Like what experiences did you draw on, or how did you take that character from beginning to end?
So the character of Nathan Pritchard is, they're all my favorite, but I have this real soft spot for him because I feel like, particularly when you're talking about men who go through a loss with their partner, their job is always to carry the load, and their job is always to protect and to nurture and to stiff upper lip and suck it up and be a man and that kind of thing. And so I really wanted to approach him from a very respectful point of view in that, he's a wounded creature too. Exactly as wounded as his wife is, particularly in the beginning, and then moving through the story. I mean, they both go through different forms of physical assault, and I wanted to make sure it was important to me to make sure that the reader understands that the effect on the human being is the same, and that it fractures you. And just because you're a man doesn't mean you suffer less from an intrusion like that. I would say that, he's not drawn from life or anything like that, but he's probably drawn from, every man I've ever known who has suffered in some way, and usually in silence. And, if you have even, like a tiny little bit of empathy in you, you look at men and like I have a son. And I remember when he was young, I remember looking at him and thinking of the terrible burden he was going to have in growing up to be a man. They have challenges that I'll never understand. And I tried very hard to understand what the challenge would be as a husband and a father to be, what that would be like to try to shoulder the burden for someone who is, perceived to be maybe weaker than you. Whether or not that's true, we can talk about, but that's where the character of Nathan Pritchard came from for me.
That's really cool. I feel like I'm talking so much.
I forgot what our question was to begin with.
I feel like I'm making my Deanna Troi face a lot.
Oh, wait.
Do you have it?
I do. So once upon a time, Dana was like, I would love to feel like Dana knows my struggles as a fellow writer. And she's like, I just want you to feel like you always have someone with you. So she gave me the Deanna Troi figure, which admittedly looks a lot like Dana, especially in the purple jumpsuit arena.
I almost wore purple today. I'm really glad.
Oh my God. Yeah. She's right. Yep. She's right next to me. She's right next to my desk. It's real good.
So we've touched on this a little bit, and I'd like to kind of jump back to it, about feminism and Georgia Pritchard. How does Georgia Pritchard personify like the classical character of a woman in a horror story, and how does she deviate from that? And would you consider Georgia Pritchard to be an example of feminism, or would you not? I wanted to read you guys a quote, and I think it's important, you know, and for anyone who hasn't read the book, Georgia Pritchard is not what you would call a Katniss Everdeen. She's not a superhero type. She doesn't have secret power. She doesn't have anything. She's just a woman, and dealing with the challenges that she faces in these extreme circumstances. I think, like Adria was saying, you know, as best she can, even if that means she's literally just picking herself up off the ground. I read a quote last week that I wanted to read to you guys, and I wanted to know contextually if you feel like this fits within the story. Lana Del Rey, one of my favorite performers, she issued a statement because, you know, of all of the commentary that has been made on the songs that she chooses to write and the way she chooses to dress. And she released this quote, and I read it, and I thought, it fascinated me, especially from someone who, you know, she professes to not be a feminist, which is amazing, because then you listen to this and I wonder, she said, "There has to be a place in feminism for women who look and act like me, the kind of women who are slanted mercilessly for being their authentic, delicate selves, the kind of women who get their own stories and voices taken away from them by stronger women or by men who hate women." And I thought that was really, it was really poignant for me, because as I was creating the character of Georgia Pritchard, you know, with regards to some beta readers, not this one over here. I don't know, am I pointing at you? Hard to say.
Yeah, you were actually, on my screen you were. That was pretty cool. And I think since I'm the one recording it, yes, you pointed in the right direction.
Editors that I've worked with over the years, they've all suggested that, you know, they've made comments about, oh, well, she needs to be this and she needs to be that. You know, this is what a strong woman is. And I've had a lot of commentary on that. And as a woman myself, you know, I don't like having a model put in front of me and told this is what a strong woman looks like. So I wanted to know, like, in the context of like the feminist tradition in books, like, where do you see Georgia Pritchard fitting in?
I feel like feminism has become kind of a four-letter word, like, even for those of us who are feminists. I just feel like I feel like there's like this very outspoken group of people at the top who've decided what that looks like, and these are the rules of feminism. And I think that's kind of BS, because I think feminism should really literally just be, you can be who you want to be and don't tear each other down for it. Like, I feel like that should just be the basic, like, this is how I like to be a person, and that's how you like to be a person, and we each have our individual choices as far as how we would like to express ourselves. And, you know, as long as we're not doing damage to anybody else, then so be it. That's how I think about it. And in which case, I mean, she doesn't really interact with any other female characters, so it's hard to really say, like, how she would be. But I feel like she is her authentic self, and as such, you know, like, I mean, I feel like she has an authentic relationship with her husband. She's not, like, subservient to him in any way. Like, she expresses herself and has an opinion and, you know, is herself. So I think that would make her, you know, as feminist as anybody else in this case. You know, she does her own stuff. She does, like, what she wants to do. She makes her own choices as a person.
That's such a fascinating combination of things that you said, too, because, I mean, I always thought of feminism as being just the basic belief that women are people and that they are on equal standing with other people who happen to be men or people who identify as men. But your interesting point about, like, there's a spectrum, and that at the top, there might be people who are dictating what that means. And so that necessarily is saying sort of that there's, like, infighting within the feminist community, and a lot of that is going to be women. And then you jumped into the point about how Georgia's making her own choices, but she's not interacting with other women. And I'm like, well, that's really fascinating, because how much of that then is her being able to be exactly who she is because she's in a space to do so? Like, she's not being torn down by other expectations. Like, if she were out in the world going through all of this, would she have to also be fighting?
Yeah, we don't
people
know.
People who are, like, quote unquote stronger than she is? Because I remember a lot of those comments that you would get, Dana, where it was like, well, she should be stronger. She should stand up more here. But what's more badass or what's more feminist than doing all of the shit that she's doing on her own? And I feel like it doesn't make her less female, less human, less worthy, less feminist because she's not like grinning and bearing it and not like feeling hurt and feeling pain and feeling fear. And you know what I mean? It's Adria's point about her resilience being her overarching theme of like, she just gets up and does it over and over again. Like there's nothing more feminist than that. So as a character, does she look more like sort of older or more classical themed women who seem like not a Katniss Everdeen, like she's not out there with a rifle and barring the door and things like that? Maybe, but that doesn't make her any less of not only a feminist, but a modern feminist. You know, I think letting her have the space to be exactly who she is a feminist act too.
I mean, we kind of talked about, like, we didn't talk about it, but we texted about The Wall recently, and it has like some themes of that, where it's like you are stuck by yourself and you're doing what you have to do to survive, you know, like you just, by the grit of your own will and whatever that looks like for you, you're fighting through it, and there's nobody there to tell you you're wrong or you're right. You just have to do what you have to do in the moment to keep going.
See also the yellow wallpaper, which is, you know, the other side of that too, where it's just like you can succumb even when you're by yourself. And what does that look like? Yeah, what does that look like? And does that mean that the woman in that story is not a feminist? Does that mean that she's not a strong female just because at the end of it all she's creeping? Oh God.
Oh, creeping.
Sorry so much, but you know, does that mean she's not a strong woman because she like didn't make it out sane, I guess? I don't know. I don't think so.
I don't think so either.
And I think that's such an interesting question, like, you know, who, and particularly that I think The Wall, which is a wonderful book, and if you've never read it, you should read it. And Adria introduced me to it, and it's just a life-changing book, but it's like, who are you in isolation? If there is no one for you to be, for someone to have an opinion about, if it's just you, who are you and how do you make your decisions? That's just, and that book is just the epitome of exploring that. Rivet. Oh, I love that book. Love it.
That's so cool. So I'm just going to put a little time marker out there. We are at 2:00 and we started a little after. So I know we started a little after. So I wanted to make sure that we get all the questions in that we want to ask. We still have a little bit of time, depending, but I wanted to be mindful of folks' responsibilities and other activities today. And I wanted to see how, if there was any one or two questions that we definitely wanted to get answered and kind of captured today.
I mean, I'd love to throw it over to you and any questions that you have that you wanted to ask me about the book, about writing, or anything like that. I guess if I had any final question, the one thing I would want to know from you guys is like, what scares you? Like, what scares you, like, on an elemental level? And was it anything that was in this book?
Well, I mean, you can ask Sydney. I will usually not watch any poltergeist movies because I don't like. What scares me are things in houses, like in your own house. Like, so I tend to not read or watch horror that has anything to do with something happening in like a house that could be my house. Like, I'm kind of, sometimes spooky old mansions I'm fine with. I'm like, I will never actually own like a castle, so it will be okay if that happens in an ancient castle. But generally, like, I won't watch like, I don't like anything where someone is like body is taken over, or like, what's the word for that? Oh my gosh.
Possession.
Thank you. Possessions. I don't like possessions. They freak me out.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like things that happen in houses, especially basements, because we're all afraid of our basements anyhow.
Yes.
I don't need to be more afraid of my basement than I already am. So I was like, oh no, it's a house one.
Oh, it's a basement one too.
Basement one. There's a house in the basement. I struggled through it. It was fine, but it was like one of those things where I'm like, yep, this is not the kind of book that like I tend to read. I like it, like, but Sydney has difference. You don't like zombies, you know.
Zombies. Well, so what was scary to me that existed in this book, I love a ghost story and I love a haunted house story. So I was already like sold. For me, I always thought, and I don't see a lot of it in horror, but the things that scare the shit out of me or would scare me is somebody's face or physical features for sure, but also just personality subtly shifting over time. Like they were one way at the start, and then by the end, they're completely different, but all those little shifts along the way, whether it's possession or whether it's an external force changing them. And so the whole like Nathan thing, just like,
Also,
anytime where, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say also like the Rosemary's Baby element of it. Like, you know, like,
love
like,
it.
Being pregnant is already so creepy. Like, you've already got this like alien thing growing inside of you, but then to have it confirmed that it really is not a human thing inside of you, like it's something else, you're just like, cool, that's awesome.
Yep.
Love that.
I couldn't hear you, Heather. What did you say?
I said, yeah, and the baby talks too.
Yeah.
Oh.
Talks.
You're like singing songs to you.
Why are you talking to me? Yeah.
I think I'm most scared. I won't watch a movie that's about demonic possession. And that must be on some level. I think it's real. I think that like evil
I won't watch those either.
And then I was like, but what? And it was a different one. It wasn't like, you know, his eyes were glowing and you could see the evil in him. It was, but I was like, oh, that got me.
I get sleep paralysis sometimes. It's rare these days, knock on wood. But yeah, some of those descriptions, I was like, that's like when you're like half awake, half asleep, and you're like, I should be able to move and I can't.
And this kind of back to what Sydney was saying about the transformation of Nathan. Like, I think that goes to like the gut of a lot of like, you know, like all of us have a partner that we trust, and that horror of that person becoming something we cannot trust anymore is also like everybody's worst nightmare, you know, like either because they were demonically possessed or they just turned into an a-hole, you know, it's just like, but you know, like nobody like that's like, I think everybody's fear is like, oh, we have this partnership and like we trust each other, and then when something shifts and that person becomes someone we don't recognize anymore is like one of the worst
news bears
that we could think about.
Well, I'd like to apologize then because we hit all the
No,
triggers.
I love it. Love it. You put no zombies in here. Thank you.
No zombies. There were no zombies. No, it's fine.
But the world feels like a zombie apocalypse, so
I don't know.
that's
Nathan
great.
went kind of zombie for it. Like,
yeah,
I mean, he was altered into something not
true.
Right.
Not right.
Not right.
I think it's so interesting because it's the demonic possession that seems to be the big trigger for everyone, and yet there's a dead kid running around the house and like,
love it.
Cool.
doesn't scare me at all. Yeah.
I don't know. Like
it's the light, you know.
I feel like quickly her relationship with Georgia became like they needed each other so much, like that didn't become frightening anymore. I think fairly quickly for me. Like at first you're like, whoa, where is this going?
Right.
This doesn't seem right.
Why is she doing this?
But it seemed fairly obvious fairly quickly that like Edith wasn't a threat. You know, besides the fact that it was just making Georgia be sneaky, and like that part, it was a little concerning where you're like, oh, well, when you're hiding things from your significant other, like that's a problem.
Yeah.
But, you know, like as far as their relationship with each other, like obviously they were feeding each other in ways that they both needed, and like it didn't become like it kind of, I don't know, she became not very threatening quickly enough for me where you're like, okay, she's cool, we're not going to worry about that. It's like,
my husband always had an interesting comment after he read the first couple drafts of this. And like I said, we've been living in this really creepy 1921 home that needed a lot of work, and he wasn't home very often. And he read the first couple drafts of the book, and he was like, basically, this is all about how you hate doing garden work and you think our basement is gross.
you're like, well,
fair.
Yeah,
also,
I
mean, right? Maybe there's some of that coming up, but also God and the devil. I mean, you know, like just.
I mean, other things, yeah.
Throw it all in there.
yeah.
It's kitchen soup kind of story. I don't know what I'm trying to say. Mixed
kitchen sink, maybe.
Kitchen sink, maybe kitchen. Also, but too many soups in the pot. And now I'm just making. Yeah. Too many cooks in the kitchen. Too much stuff. Okay, I'm stopping now. There's no more. I want to ask about what's next for you. What are your next steps? So what's next for you for writing? What's next for you for a project? What other kinds of things do you have going on?
Oh, well, so Roseneath will come out in October. So I'm like doing all the bits and pieces to make sure that, that goes out in the way I want it to. Now there are two sequels to Roseneath. They're already done. So those will be coming out in the next few years, I would imagine. Because I have some other projects that I want to work on in between. The second book, so this book you have a character who is pregnant with something that's kind of beyond description, and the second book is called Relict, and it takes place 27 years after the events in the first book, and it's told entirely from the point of view of the Pritchard's child, and it's all about her relationship with this character named Michael, who is the character of the Archangel in the book. When I first conceived of the whole idea for this series of books, I wanted it to be, the first book is about the experiences of two humans. The second book is all about the experiences of two angels or otherworldly creatures, if you will. And the third book, which is called Raven, is entirely about two gods. And I really wanted to, a lot of it is me working out all of the things that I really struggled with as a child growing up in a very religious family. What are these creatures and what are their motivations and that sort of thing. So I'm really excited to push those out. Right now I am working on a memoir cookbook, which is called Woeful Cooking, Growing Up Gray Trash in Cleveland. And it's a huge, it's a huge deviation from Gothic horror, but you got to lighten it up in between projects a little bit. So it's basically about, growing up poor and what poor kids eat and how, when I was a kid, I tried to make pop out of like water and sugar, and I think I poured maple extract into it. I mean, I drank it, but it was gross.
My sisters and I used to try to make milkshakes out of toothpaste and water.
Oh, honey.
They were not good.
It's rough growing up trying to make rich kid food,
Yep.
You go over to the friend's house and their mom always has Capri Suns.
Pringles and corn pops and shit, and you're just like oh.
We weren't allowed to have sugar.
Nope, me neither. I think I've said this to both Dana and Adria before. I have like an ongoing horror of the carob chip.
There's nothing worse than tossing it in like a handful of that and thinking it's semi-sweet chocolate.
It's like, it's a treat. Oh, Jesus. No.
Can I just have raisins instead? That's very
seriously. Just give me an apple. Just give me some real food.
Carob chips are so disgusting.
Yeah, it's cruel. It's cruel.
Mm-hmm. Child cruelty for sure.
Yeah. No, thank you. No, thank you. Yeah, we used to, my family, like we were real poor, so we got charity food. So we got like cans that didn't have labels on them, so it was like, what horrible surprises for dinner tonight. Yep. And we would get there was this place that would give us big 5-gallon buckets filled with powdered milk.
Oh God, I hate powdered milk so much.
Oh God. And I just remember when it was my turn to make the milk, you got to measure it out into a jar or a bottle and then add water and then shake it. And it's this wrong color and it's gritty and it settles out. Oh. Yeah. So yeah, that's what I'm working on.
Can't wait to make some of those recipes.
Yeah.
Oh, no. It's going to be, I'm putting a disclaimer on it. These are recipes you don't want to make. So it's like a non-cookbook.
That's why.
No.
Funny. All right.
But I wanted to know if anybody had any closing comments on the book. And before we end, I just want to thank you all for reading it. It means the world to me. It really does. I'm in awe of all of you as women and as readers too. You've always all had such good suggestions for me to read, and it's just, this is a really great safe place for me to sort of push my book out into the world, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you for trusting us to
Yeah.
do this. Yeah.
You're trusting us with your baby. Are there any questions that you wish we'd asked? Are there any questions that you wish that we'd brought up for discussion that we missed?
I mean, I guess I'm really interested to know what you think about, I guess that would be like a kind of a two-part question. And if we don't have time, that's cool too. I don't know if anybody's in a big hurry, but I wanted to know what you thought about the evolution of the relationship between Georgia and Nathan Pritchard from the beginning to the end, and where this book leaves them. And also, what do you think Edith is? You know, seeing how she changes and where she ends up at the end of the book, like, what do you think she is? Where do you think she's going? I'm just curious what people think. I mean, I know where I'm sending her, but I always wonder where people think people are going, that sort of thing.
I like Georgia and Nathan in the beginning, like, you know, classic so in love story. And I like to read about people who phase in and out of reality or kind of forget where they are. I do that all the time. I think the older I get, the more I do that. But it was so interesting that they were both doing that, but they were doing it together too, and they kept missing each other. And then coming full circle to the end, where it turns out it's really weird, but it's okay somehow. So I like that about them.
I mean, I think that they went through some stuff together, and I think that that's kind of like, and like, it's nice to read things where it was like in the middle it seemed like, wow, this is not gonna work out, like things went real bad. But it's always encouraging to read a story where people go through incredibly difficult things, and in real life, or in this case metaphysically, and then they find their way back to each other and get through it together. And, you know, it just seemed like in the end, it made them stronger as a couple to have gone through all of these things and fought their way through it together. As far as where Edith is going, I don't know, like, I don't tend to try to project that kind of thing. Like, I'm definitely like a reader that I'm like, even when I'm reading a mystery, I don't try to figure it out. Like, as I get kind of ticked off if it's obvious what is the end. I was like, I just want to be like entertained. So a lot of times I'm not trying to figure out the mystery. I just want to like go along for the ride. And I feel like it's the same with this kind of story. I'm like, at the end, you're like, well, I am interested to see what happens next. And I don't tend to like try to figure it out too much. Like, I don't tend to like project forward and think about where they're going. I'm like, I will be like more, I will just wait and see what happens.
That's so interesting.